Sorry, this is where chronology in this course gets confusing. In this lecture, we will stay mostly in the first decades of the 20th century, the same period as the Expressionists and Cubists we reviewed in our last class. But today, our focus shifts to artists who pursued political agendas or visions of utopia. This photo comes from an exhibit of Italian futurist art at the Guggenheim Museum. Futurism used to be a College Board favorite. It's dropped from the list, but I find it too influential, too intriguing, and frankly, too creepy to drop altogether. For much of this course, Italy has been an epicenter of art, but in the early 20th century, many young Italians came to despise what they described as Italy's museum mentality. The futurists revered modernity, motion, and above all, speed. As founder Filippo Marinetti put it, quote, "A speeding automobile is more beautiful than the Nike of Samothrace." More disturbingly, futurist artists glorified war. There was actually a lot of this war frenzy going around among intellectuals in pre-World War I Europe. Social Darwinists believed that nations, like species, obeyed the law of the survival of the fittest, and that the strong, frankly, deserved to conquer the weak. Nietzsche's emphasis on embracing passion and exercising the will to power translated for many into a worship of violence and a justification for conquest. Some historians believe that these attitudes actually contributed to European powers' willingness to be swept into a pointless and in the end devastatingly destructive war. Severini was one of the founding members of the Futurist movement and a signatory of the Futurist Manifesto. This painting presents what our Gardner's textbook calls a sanitized version of an armored train, complete with sleek cannons and highly stylized troops bearing rifles. There is no blood and gore in this painting, and the colors are disconcertingly bright and cheerful. It's like the Fauves go to war. But the reality of slogging trench warfare turned out to be a whole lot grimmer. Note how this triptych echoes the form of altar paintings, complete with a memento mori at the bottom. We've already seen Kirchner's grim evocation of the cost of war. Now we see a grim evocation of its aftermath in a defeated and desperate Germany. In January 1919, communist leader Karl Liebknecht, along with fellow communist Rosa Luxemburg, led an armed revolt against Germany's post-war government. He was assassinated by right-wing paramilitary units. The artist Kathe Kollwitz, a social democrat who actually didn't support the communists, agreed to create this memorial because she admired Liebknecht's charisma and the support of his working-class followers. Woodcuts had almost disappeared with the advent of what seemed like more sophisticated print techniques, especially lithography. So why did it turn out to be so well suited to expressionist art? Well, note the harsh, thick, angular lines of the work. We've seen this in Kirchner's work as well, and this is something that woodcut is particularly appropriate for. Kollwitz was especially famous for her depiction of mothers and children, often dead children. The tradition of the highly emotional German pietà lives on in her work. The theme of this work was actually the carnage of the 17th century wars of religion, but it proved to be prophetic. Kollwitz's own son would perish in World War I, which only reinforced her commitment to portraying the suffering of women and children in a world racked by violence. She was also committed to depicting the plight of the working class. This is a somewhat earlier work and a sandpapered etching, not a woodcut. Though these works employ different print techniques, they all rely heavily on line, which sparingly but very evocatively communicates suffering and oppression. And now we move east to Russia and the art of the Russian Revolution. Many Russian artists embraced avant-garde for the same reason that Italian painters launched Futurism. They despised their country's past and wanted to see their society and its art modernized and transformed. Suprematism was a Russian avant-garde movement that celebrated, quote, the supremacy of pure feeling, unquote, that is, abstraction, and its most famous proponent was Kazimir Malevich. These two pro-Soviet propaganda posters show the influence of suprematism, now harnessed to promote the new communist regime. Once the Russian Civil War was over, the victorious communist leaders called for art that would more clearly serve the revolution and help build a new society. avant-garde artists eagerly offered their services to the new state. So let's see a video clip that describes Soviet artists' response, an artistic movement known as Constructivism. So here's our next required work, which is a photomontage. Photomontage builds on the synthetic cubism that I discussed earlier. It was also used extensively by Dada artists. Stay tuned. But while Stepanova's constructivist photomontage is much less abstract, it still juxtaposes images in a way that plays with time and space and encourages the viewer to make connections. Although Lenin features prominently on the upper right, by 1932, when this work was created, he had been dead for 8 years. Stalin, who was a ruthless dictator, was now in charge, and in fact he openly despised the avant-garde. Indeed, he sent many leading communist artists to the Gulag prison camp or even to their graves. Stepanova survived these years by keeping her mouth shut and by offering her talents to Stalin's propaganda machine. As your homework noted, the main target audience for this work was really foreign audiences, foreign leaders or foreign intellectuals whom Stalin hoped to impress with the Soviet Union's undoubted industrial progress and to distract from the atrocities associated with the forced industrialization and agricultural collectivism that was outlined and executed in the 5-year plan. Eventually, Stalin soured even on constructivist art. Like Hitler, he had no patience for abstraction, and in 1932 he decreed that socialist realism, naturalistic art that celebrated the worker and the communist regime, was the only acceptable art form. So here's a famous example. And note that this work fits into the same tradition, but with a more romantic gloss and more references to traditional landscape paintings. I find it a little hard to look past this work's roots in propaganda for a brutal regime, but I can admire Stepanova's compositional genius. There's a fascinating use of line, especially those electric wires that connect Lenin to the public address speakers and the banners proclaiming the Soviet Union. CCCP stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. C is a pronoun like an S, and Sovietsky Soyuz is Russian for the Soviet Union. The brilliant red captures and directs the eye in sharp contrast to the black, white, and sepia tones. Diagonal lines create a sense of dynamism, shades of the Baroque, as does Stepanova's choice to use different sized images. Away from the maelstrom of revolutionary Russia and post-war Germany, utopian visions often took on a more abstract cast. 2 examples of this are the organic sculpture of Brancusi and the geometric paintings of Mondrian. Both artists sought a more rational, more humane new order. We've talked a little about this sculpture. The video clip puts it into the context of a move toward abstraction and offers an excellent introduction to our next required work by Mondrian. By the way, this segment of the video comes just before the segment on Soviet art, suprematism, and constructivism, or the movements that the narrator is referring to at the end of the clip. The video does not include the label for the movement that Mondrian led, but you still need to know the name de stijl, and perhaps also, means the style, by the way, in Dutch, and perhaps also the term for Mondrian's earlier works, new plasticism. The leaders of the de stijl art movement decided to go back to the basics of form and color. In doing so, they decided to focus on 3 things in their art. 1, horizontal and vertical lines. No diagonals were allowed. They were seen as disturbing the utopian calm that Mondrian wished to promote. 2, the work should employ the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue, along with black and white. Primary colors are, after all, the basic building blocks of the color universe, and this art is all about reducing images to their simplest and most basic forms. And 3, the works employed an asymmetrical balance. De stijl artists wanted to convey balance and harmony, but they felt that asymmetry added a needed element of contrast and energy. As the expert in the video just explained, Mondrian sought to create a compositional harmony that he hoped would act as a counter to the chaos he saw in the world around him. So in its way, this is one more reaction to war and revolution, an artistic version of calm down, be serene. De Stijl's greatest impact actually came in the field of architecture. Here is a De Stijl house constructed in the Netherlands. Note the assemblage of geometric shapes. This used to be a College Board favorite. The house's architect, Rietveld, also designed furniture for his open-plan houses. Looks a bit like a furniture version of a Mondrian painting, doesn't it? In my next lecture, I will leave this logical utopian world and take us to the wild worlds of Dada and Surrealism.